The year is 1940. Europe is ablaze. Nazi Germany has conquered France and is relentlessly bombing Britain. The United States, though officially neutral, remains deeply divided. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, a seasoned leader who guided the nation through the Great Depression, is seeking an unprecedented third term, arguing his experience is vital in a world on the brink. His opponent, Republican Wendell Willkie, a dark horse candidate and businessman with no prior political experience, is running a surprisingly strong campaign. FDR narrowly wins, leading the country through World War II and establishing America as a global superpower. But what if the outcome of that pivotal election had been different? And against all odds, Wendell Willkie won the 1940 U.S. presidential election? Our point of divergence takes us to November 1940, a slight shift in a few key states, perhaps fueled by stronger isolationist sentiment or a greater desire for a fresh face after years of the New Deal, swings the election. Wendell Willkie, a former utility executive, becomes the 33rd President of the United States. His campaign promises included keeping America out of war, a strong pro-business stance, and a less centralized government than Roosevelt's. Willkie's arrival in the White House signaled an immediate and profound shift from the Roosevelt era. His presidency was a direct repudiation of the expansive federal government that had defined the New Deal. One of his first priorities was to initiate a systematic review and ultimately a dismantling of many New Deal programs. Agencies like the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, and the Works Progress Administration, WPA, seen by Willkie as symbols of government overreach and inefficiency, faced severe budget cuts and eventual phase-outs. The very philosophy of large-scale federal employment projects was replaced with an emphasis on private sector-led recovery. Tax incentives for businesses were introduced and regulations were eased, all aimed at stimulating corporate investment and growth rather than relying on public spending. This economic philosophy had a mixed impact. While some industries, particularly those with existing strong private sector ties, experienced a boom, the rapid withdrawal of federal support for public works created localized economic shocks and increased unemployment in areas that had heavily relied on New Deal initiatives. Cities with significant WPA projects saw immediate job losses and a surge in poverty, contrasting sharply with the booming defense plants in more industrial regions. The social safety net, painstakingly woven by Roosevelt, began to fray. Social Security, while likely not abolished outright due to its growing popularity, faced calls for significant reform, with debates centering on reduced benefits or higher eligibility requirements, leading to increased anxiety among the elderly and vulnerable populations. The promise of long-term economic security, a hallmark of FDR's legacy, was replaced with a more laissez-faire approach, placing greater responsibility on individuals and private charities. The labor movement, which had gained significant ground under FDR, found itself on the defensive, as Willkie's administration was less sympathetic to union demands and more aligned with corporate interests. Strikes, especially in critical industries, became a more pronounced threat. Willkie, facing the dual pressure of rearming the nation and adhering to his pro-business principles, would be forced into uncomfortable compromises. He might use federal troops to break strikes, or more likely, broker uneasy truces that left labor feeling alienated and resentful. This domestic tension, simmering beneath the surface, would undeniably influence the nation's capacity to react to external threats. Willkie, a businessman at heart, believed that free markets and corporate efficiency were the ultimate engines of American power. He initially resisted calls for direct government intervention in industrial planning, preferring to incentivize private companies to ramp up production through contracts and tax breaks, rather than through direct federal control. The arsenal of democracy concept would still take root, but with a different flavor, more driven by private enterprise and less by centralized federal direction. This decentralized approach, while ideologically consistent with Willkie's platform, led to bottlenecks and inefficiencies in initial war production. Factories might be hesitant to retool for military production without guaranteed profits, or they might prioritize civilian goods for too long. The absence of an equivalent to Roosevelt's War Production Board in its early decisive form meant coordination between various industries and military branches proved cumbersome without robust federal agencies and experienced wartime planners that Roosevelt had cultivated. The crucial early months of mobilization would be slower, costing valuable time as the world outside burned. Procurement scandals. Driven by less federal oversight and intense competition among private firms, might also emerge, further complicating the war effort and eroding public trust. The political landscape in Washington would be turbulent. While Willkie had won the presidency, Congress would remain a complex and often hostile environment. Many Democrats, loyal to Roosevelt and the New Deal, would view Willkie's agenda with suspicion, and even Republican isolationists might resist broad military spending. This legislative gridlock would further hamper efforts to quickly ramp up defense production or pass necessary wartime legislation. Willkie's lack of a strong, established political machine, a stark contrast to FDR's, meant he'd spend more energy navigating DC infighting than focusing solely on the looming global crisis. Public opinion itself would be volatile. As news from Europe grew increasingly dire, the initial isolationist fervor that helped elect Willkie would begin to wane, replaced by growing anxiety and a clamor for preparedness, forcing Willkie to adapt, often belatedly, to a shifting national mood. The immediate impact on foreign policy was a stark contrast to Roosevelt's increasingly interventionist stance. Willkie's public commitment to keeping America out of war, coupled with his limited foreign policy experience, translated into a hesitant and reactive approach to the escalating global conflict. His Secretary of State, likely a more conservative, less internationally minded figure than Cordell Hull, perhaps figures like Robert Taft or a less internationally inclined diplomat, would reflect this caution, prioritizing diplomatic maneuvers and economic incentives over bold commitments. This lack of a clear, strong voice from Washington created an international vacuum, signaling to aggressors that America was unlikely to intervene decisively. The crucial Lend-Lease program, the lifeline that sustained Britain and later the Soviet Union, faced immense hurdles under a Willkie administration. Initially proposed by Roosevelt, it would have encountered a deeply skeptical Willkie. He might have seen it as an entanglement, a drain on American resources, or a step too close to direct military involvement. Instead of the sweeping authority granted by FDR, any aid package would likely be significantly scaled back, subject to stringent conditions, or even replaced by a more limited cash and carry system that Britain, already financially exhausted, could ill afford. Public opinion, though shifting, was still heavily influenced by isolationist sentiments, and Willkie would feel immense pressure to honor his campaign promise. This delay or substantial reduction in aid would have devastating consequences. Without American material flowing freely, Britain's ability to resist the Nazi war machine would be severely tested. The Battle of Britain, already a near-run thing, could see the RAF struggling more acutely for replacements and fuel, potentially leading to a more prolonged and damaging bombing campaign against British cities and infrastructure. This prolonged assault might compel Britain to withdraw fighter squadrons from other theaters, such as North Africa, or even consider desperate diplomatic overtures to Germany, seeking a negotiated peace to avert total destruction. Churchill's position would become increasingly precarious, facing immense pressure from within his own party for a less aggressive stance, or even his removal if British morale shattered. The U-boat menace in the Atlantic would grow even more lethal, as without early and robust American naval support and convoy systems, merchant shipping lanes would be vulnerable, crippling British supply lines and bringing the island nation to the brink of starvation. Convoys, when implemented, would be smaller, less protected, and suffer higher losses, prolonging the logistical nightmare for the Allies and diverting critical British naval assets from other areas. The very survival of Britain as an independent fighting power would hang by a thread. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, facing the full brunt of the Nazi invasion in 1941, would find itself tragically isolated. The brutal winter and vast distances might still slow the German advance, but without the desperately needed American trucks, locomotives, food, industrial equipment, and vital raw materials provided by Lend-Lease, the Red Army's ability to sustain its counteroffensives would be severely hampered. The Soviet industrial base, relocated eastward, would lack the critical infusions of machinery and technical expertise needed for mass production. German forces, even after the brutal winter, would find less resistance from a logistically starved and under-equipped Red Army in 1942. A Soviet collapse under immense pressure would become a much more distinct possibility, allowing Hitler to consolidate control over vast European territories, freeing up resources for other fronts and strengthening his hold on the continent. Germany could then divert more forces to the Mediterranean, North Africa, or even begin planning for an invasion of Britain with renewed vigor. The scale of civilian suffering and military casualties on the Eastern Front would be even more catastrophic than in our timeline, potentially leading to widespread famine and societal collapse in Soviet-controlled areas. The very notion of a Soviet counteroffensive might be delayed for years, if it ever occurred on the same scale. Stalin, isolated and facing utter defeat, might even be forced to seek a desperate, humiliating truce with Germany, carving up Eastern Europe and freeing Hitler to focus entirely on the West. The global balance of power would undeniably be in flux. China, desperately fighting Japan, would find its plea for aid met with a less sympathetic ear from Washington. Lacking American material and diplomatic pressure on Japan, China's war effort might falter more profoundly, leading to greater territorial losses, a more fragmented, desperate resistance, and possibly even the collapse of the nationalist government, leaving a power vacuum or a more ascendant communist movement. Japan, unconstrained by a looming U.S. threat, might press further into Southeast Asia, potentially targeting India or even Australia's northern territories with greater boldness. Nations in Latin America, previously drawn into America's sphere of influence by Roosevelt's good neighbor policy and economic ties, might find themselves seeking alliances elsewhere, or becoming more susceptible to Axis influence due to a less engaged Washington. German and Italian propaganda would find fertile ground, exploiting anti-Yankee sentiment and offering economic incentives that Willkie's cautious approach might not match. Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, facing less U.S. pressure, might maintain stricter neutrality, or even lean towards Axis trade and economic partnerships. Even Canada, traditionally a close ally, might find itself shouldering a disproportionately larger burden in the Allied effort, potentially leading to deeper economic strain and a more isolationist stance from its powerful neighbor, forcing it to look more towards Britain for leadership and resources. Willkie, a pragmatist by nature, would be forced to navigate this deteriorating global landscape, constantly battling isolationist voices within his own party and a skeptical Congress. His learning curve on foreign policy would be steep, and every decision would be a gamble, often made with an incomplete understanding of the geopolitical stakes. This lack of a strong, unified American voice on the world stage would embolden aggressors and leave democratic nations feeling increasingly vulnerable. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941 would still occur, an unprovoked act that would undoubtedly force Wilkie's hand and propel America into the war. Even for a cautious president, the direct assault on American territory would be undeniable. The public outcry would be immense, providing Wilkie with the mandate to act. However, his administration's response might differ significantly. Without FDR's long-standing relationships with military leaders, forged over years of collaboration and trust, the initial mobilization could be less efficient, marked by bureaucratic infighting and a slower transition from a civilian to a wartime economy. The National Guard might not be as readily federalized, and the conscription process could face more resistance or be implemented with less initial effectiveness. Civilian industries would pivot more slowly to military production, prioritizing their own profits over national urgency without forceful federal mandates. The arsenal of democracy might take longer to fully materialize, or its output might be less focused, impacting the flow of critical supplies to the front lines. Strategic decisions, particularly in the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, might evolve differently. A less experienced commander-in-chief might prioritize a more defensive stance in the Pacific or be slower to commit forces to Europe, potentially extending the war's duration. The Germany first strategy might be less firmly adopted, with a greater emphasis placed on avenging Pearl Harbor, potentially delaying critical aid to the European theater even further. This diversion of resources, however small, could have disproportionate impacts on an already strained European front. The entire course of World War II would be dramatically altered, with a delayed or weakened American entry combined with a potentially collapsing Soviet Union. The war in Europe would become far longer and more brutal. Germany, facing less pressure from a weakened Eastern Front, could fortify its Western defenses more effectively, potentially allocating more resources to the development of advanced weaponry, like jet aircraft, long-range missiles like the V-2, or even early biological/chemical weapons programs. The D-Day invasion, a pivotal moment in our timeline, might be postponed indefinitely or face even fiercer resistance due to Germany's stronger strategic position, leading to unimaginably higher Allied casualties and a protracted grind across Europe. Without a robust Eastern Front to tie down German divisions, any cross-channel invasion would face an even more formidable Atlantic wall, manned by more experienced and better equipped troops. The liberation of France and the Low Countries would be a slower, bloodier affair, if it happened at all in the same time frame. The concentration camps and atrocities of the Holocaust might continue for a longer period, given the extended duration of Nazi control over vast territories, resulting in an even greater loss of life. Resistance movements across occupied Europe, receiving less external support, might be more isolated and easily suppressed. Their leaders hunted down with greater efficiency by the Gestapo. In the Pacific, a less robust American war effort, initially hampered by the delayed mobilization and potentially different strategic priorities, could allow Japan to consolidate its gains across Southeast Asia and the Pacific more effectively. The island-hopping campaign might be slower, more costly, and the eventual defeat of Japan could be a longer, more arduous process, possibly involving even more devastating atomic strikes or a protracted land invasion of the Japanese home islands, leading to even greater loss of life on both sides. Naval battles like Midway might still occur, but with potentially different outcomes if American industrial capacity struggled to replace losses or equip new ships quickly. Australia and New Zealand would face a far greater direct threat, potentially requiring a more substantial British Commonwealth commitment to their defense, stretching already thin resources. The strategic islands of the Pacific might remain in Japanese hands for longer, extending the reach of their empire. The brutal occupation of territories like the Philippines, Indochina, and Indonesia would be prolonged, leading to increased suffering and death for their populations. The development of the atomic bomb, a race against time in our history, might also be impacted. While the scientific principles would remain, the massive industrial and financial commitment required for the Manhattan Project could be slower under Willkie's more fiscally conservative and less centralized administration. Key scientific talent might be slower to be recruited or less effectively coordinated. This delay could mean the bomb is not ready until much later, or perhaps never fully developed if the war ends differently or funding is curtailed due to competing priorities. If Germany or Japan were able to make greater strides in their own nuclear programs due to a prolonged war and less Allied pressure, the outcome of the war could take an even more terrifying turn, potentially ending with the use of such weapons by multiple belligerents, or even a nuclear stalemate that prolongs the conflict indefinitely. The strategic bombing campaigns against Germany and Japan might also be less effective due to delayed production of long-range bombers and escort fighters, allowing Axis industries to continue production for longer and strengthening their defensive capabilities. The air war, already devastating, would become even more protracted and bloody. The post-war world order, influenced by conferences and the balance of power among the victors, would significantly differ. Without the strong, decisive American leadership and economic might that shaped the post-war institutions in our timeline, the future would be far more uncertain. The conferences that defined the post-war landscape, such as a hypothetical Yalta or Potsdam, would convene under vastly different circumstances, with different participants holding greater or lesser influence, likely with a more dominant Soviet or British presence if the US role was diminished. The sheer exhaustion of all major belligerents, prolonged by years of intensified warfare, would cast a long, dark shadow over any peace negotiations. The result could be a Europe dominated by a more powerful, unchecked Nazi Germany, having secured vast territories from a collapsed Soviet Union. This would be a Europe reshaped by Nazi ideology, with enduring occupation, brutal oppression, and a lasting fascist imprint. Large swathes of Eastern Europe might become German colonies, their populations brutally exploited or exterminated, leading to widespread resistance and brutal reprisals that continue long after the main conflict. Even if Germany was eventually defeated, the fragmentation of Europe would be profound. Without the Marshall Plan or a strong U.S. economic reconstruction effort, large parts of the continent could remain in prolonged economic depression, fostering instability and new conflicts, creating a breeding ground for extremist ideologies. The Iron Curtain of our timeline might be replaced by a patchwork of weakened states, buffer zones, and enduring German influence, or even a direct border between a victorious, albeit exhausted, Britain and a German-dominated continent. The geopolitical map of Europe would be unrecognizable, defined by bitter resentment, economic disparity, and ongoing nationalist struggles, potentially leading to further devastating conflicts decades later. France might never fully recover its pre-war status, and Italy could descend into prolonged civil strife. Alternatively, if Germany was eventually defeated by a significantly weakened and exhausted Britain and a highly depleted Soviet Union, assuming it survived, the power vacuum could lead to a vastly different geopolitical landscape. Perhaps Britain, desperate for resources, would cling more tightly to its empire, attempting to maintain global influence through its existing colonial structures, leading to even bloodier and more protracted decolonization conflicts as colonial subjects fight harder for their freedom against a weakened but desperate colonial power. New, regional powers might emerge, leading to a more fragmented and less stable global order, defined by localized conflicts and shifting alliances rather than a clear bipolar struggle. the concept of superpowers might not emerge in the same way, with a multipolar world characterized by constant jockeying for influence. A vastly expanded Japanese empire in Asia, if America's Pacific War effort was also hampered, would fundamentally redraw the map of East Asia, impacting China's sovereignty, the future of Korea, and the speed and nature of decolonization movements across Southeast Asia. Korea might remain under Japanese rule for decades longer, or gain independence only to fall under direct Chinese or Soviet influence. The Cold War, as we know it, centered on the US-Soviet ideological struggle, might never fully materialize in the same way. New ideological fault lines could emerge, perhaps a protracted struggle against various forms of fascism that persist in remnants of German or Japanese power, or a multipolar world with shifting alliances and constant regional conflicts, rather than a clear East-West divide. The development of a global human rights framework would be significantly delayed or even aborted in a world reeling from a more brutal war. The very notion of universal human rights might be seen as a luxury in a world struggling for mere survival. The very legacy of American global leadership would be called into question. Without FDR's confident hand guiding the Allies, and without the decisive American intervention that ultimately tipped the scales, the United States might emerge from the war as a powerful nation, but not the undisputed superpower and architect of the post-war world order it became. Its moral authority and capacity for global leadership would be significantly diminished. The United Nations might never form, or it might be a far weaker, less effective body, unable to prevent future conflicts, perhaps dissolving into a mere forum for nationalistic grievances. The Bretton Woods institutions, which laid the foundation for the post-war global economic system, might not be created, leading to a more volatile and less integrated international economy, prone to protectionism and trade wars. The trajectory of global democracy would be far more precarious, having survived a longer, more brutal assault from totalitarian regimes, leaving many nations questioning the viability of democratic governance. The very notion of a Pax Americana would be an unfulfilled dream, replaced by a more chaotic and unpredictable global landscape for decades to come, possibly leading to a third major global conflict much sooner than in our own timeline. The shadow of a world where fascism was truly dominant, even for a time, would permanently alter the geopolitical psyche. The global cultural impact of such a war would be immense, leading to a more cynical and distrustful international community, with fewer shared values and a diminished hope for lasting peace. Scientific and technological advancements might be heavily skewed towards military applications, with less emphasis on humanitarian or civilian progress. The demographic scars of a prolonged and more deadly conflict would reshape populations across continents for generations. The very concept of international law might be severely weakened, with powerful nations operating with even less restraint. This divergence from our timeline paints a stark picture of a world plunged into a deeper, more enduring darkness, where the outcome of a single election had ramifications for the entire human story.